I wanted to talk today about the Zoomers. And I am a Zoomer myself. I'm a child of the early 2000s.
Really? I didn't know. You've never mentioned it before.
No, I know, right? Yeah. A child of the Blairite and then Cameronite education system and the culture that emerged around that kind of political order.
You would have been going through school when Blair was in full swing.
Indeed, yes. Yeah. Great years,
right.
Great times.
They were actually decent times, to be honest.
And
you
the
still
energy,
had edgy TV.
Well, the early bit, anyway, yeah.
Yeah, the energy and the optimism in the air at that time was very good. But obviously we're seeing what's come of that now. And I feel like the mainstream kind of talks a lot about Gen Z rather. And it doesn't often talk to them, right? And when they do talk to them, it's often, we're treated as like, mythical creatures that are really difficult to understand and pin down and all the rest of it. But I really don't think that it's that complicated. There is also a narrative that comes out of some places that on the one side, Gen Z are super liberal and progressive and woke and snowflakes and all the rest of it.
Well, not the ones I talk to.
Well, and then on the other side, there are those who are like super, all Gen Z are super based and they're, becoming super right wing and all the rest of it. And I don't think that either of those things are true. I think that both of those narratives are serving essentially different political ends, and that the truth of the matter is actually a lot more straightforward. But we'll get into that in a minute. So, who are Gen Z? Gen Z. I keep doing that. It's the Americanism of my upbringing that's just infected my mind. So Gen Z are born between 1997 and 2012, and as of the 2021 census, Gen Z is the most ethnically diverse generation in English and British history. And according to it, 75% are white, 12% Asian, 6% are black, 5% are mixed, and 3% belong to a kind of miscellaneous ethnic group. But what's interesting is the breakdown of those different groups, because 60.5% of individuals identifying with mixed ethnic backgrounds are under 25, 37.4% of Asians are under 25, yet 25.7% of whites were under 25. So the actual the age profile of the different groups in this country, it speaks to the aging population of the indigenous population, which I think is kind of interesting in and of
But you're just
itself.
making the point how radically different this country is going to look in a couple of generations.
Well, that's the point, because remember, those statistics that I just read were from the 2021 census. This was before the Boris wave, before the millions of new people that came since then, to say nothing of the illegal migration, which of course is primarily young men. So I wonder what the reality will actually be. I mean, certainly at the 2031 census, God only knows.
Yeah.
But if you're walking the street, then you do tend to see, and anecdotally, I would say that the majority of migrants tend to be quite young.
So you might know this, Harry.
Yeah.
As I drive into Swindon in the morning, I come in through the South bit, and I go past a college, and I genuinely don't know if it's a college for South Asians only. Like, is there a college in Swindon that's just for South Asians, or is it just that there are so many South Asians that it just looks like it is?
I think the former would literally be illegal under the Equality Act.
So maybe it is just a normal school, and
Yeah.
all I see every morning is hordes of South Asian kids going there.
In my town that I live in, I've noticed that the profile of the students who hang around the town is still mostly British.
Right.
So I would imagine it's more to do with the general demographics.
Because you got out of Swindon.
Yes, I got out of Swindon as soon as I could.
You made it out.
Yes, I made it out.
So on politics,
That was also one of the reasons as well.
at the 2024 election, the majority of young people, those aged 18 to 24, they did vote for Labour. So roughly half, 40% of men. 42%
Well, that just
of women.
goes to prove they're looking for the most right-wing party they can find.
Well, perhaps, yeah. But they voted for Labour, and thereafter, about a third voted either Lib Dem or Green, with a small minority, about 1 in 5, voting broadly right-wing, let's say, if you can call the Conservative Party right-wing.
Yeah.
But I think this speaks to a number of things. First of all, it speaks to the natural liberalness of young people, which is a thing. It does exist. And I think that that's just because of the culture that we've grown up in. I said before that I, for example, am a child of the Blairite education system, which was shot through with liberal ideology. I was taught that Britain, for example, is to be understood as being a nation of values rather than a nation of people.
I went to a friend's house who had a kid doing his GCSEs histories, and I idly picked up the textbook to have a look at see what they were teaching, and there was a section, what caused the Second World War, and there was a one sentence answer underneath. It was caused by racism.
How old are the students who are supposed to be reading this textbook?
They're like 13, 14, something like that. I mean,
So beyond
where do you start with that?
I mean, because that feels like a 5-year-old's explanation of it. It was caused by racism. Yeah, no, but that's basically, you are right. The liberal ideology also goes into the history that we were taught, and in fact, it hinges entirely on the history that we were taught. Where, with my understanding that I got from school of what English history was there was a civil war. Mm-hmm. Before that, there was a mean man called Henry VIII who didn't like his women, and then all of a sudden you shoot forward to the Second World War and the Holocaust, and then civil rights. And the two main things that you were learning about that was that both of those were caused by white people being mean.
Well, this is interesting.
You've got to be very, very tolerant to people who are different.
It's funny that you've said this, because I was actually going to bring this up, because my recollection of my historical education in primary and secondary school was literally just learning about the Tudors and then the Second World War. And I think that I have a pet theory on this.
I was lucky to get the Civil War, it seems.
Well, yes, indeed. But I've got a pet theory, which is that the centering of the Tudors, and specifically Henry VIII, was done to present monarchy and that kind of that time as being one of tyranny and madness, and goodness, he was killing everybody.
This is what happens when you get the bad king, is that they're very, very mean.
But we were never taught about the good kings. We were never taught about the Alfreds and so on.
We never had any major modules that were centered around the height of the empire.
Well, exactly. Yeah. And then we were taught that the modern world begins in 1945, and everything that's come since then has been positive and progressive, and
maybe
and
1948.
Yeah. Well, indeed. But I think the vast majority of young people are not particularly political. And this is something that I think those of us in the bubble tend to forget. Because I can tell you anecdotally in my own friend group that most young people don't care about politics. Most young people don't waste their time thinking about politics because they've got more important things to worry about. Like, oh my goodness, I can't afford a house. Or, oh my goodness, I'm being excessively taxed to the point where I can't afford to move out of my parents' house until my early 30s, if I'm lucky, right? And so they don't have the time or the capacity or the bandwidth to be thinking about politics. But insofar as young people do think about politics, in my experience, and as is bear out by the figures, the most important issue tends to be environment, which I find quite interesting, and I think that speaks to the success.
So these are the issues that young people care about.
That's right, yeah. So it speaks to the how successful that particular part of the state propaganda has been. The fact that if you talk to your average young person who's not that interested in politics, they'll say, well, the main thing I care about is just the environment and preserving.
Well, I mean, actually, I possibly see it a different way, because why is the environment only up to that level, considering that's the only thing that ever gets pushed at them? That housing, education, crime, immigration, the economy, and well, maybe Brexit does.
Nobody cares about Brexit anymore.
Yeah, but none of those things get pushed relentlessly on them every time they turn on a screen or go to school. So if anything, that line should be much higher.
Perhaps, but I think that economy there is the highest priority. That's not surprising, because that's the lived reality of young people. Housing and health also being very sort of important. Again, that's just because those are the basic things you need to live. But again, you have to remember, we grew up on a diet of, David Attenborough documentaries and that kind of thing. And certainly in my own life, I spent a lot of time in the countryside when I was a lad. So it doesn't surprise me that a lot of young people really care about the environment. I think that impulse has been co-opted, however, by power to serve this agenda that actually seeks to immiserate ordinary people on the altar of net zero and these sorts of things. But I think that it is interesting, this graph here, because if you see right at the end there, April 2025, immigration and crime just about overtake environment. And I think that's very interesting, because like housing, economy and healthcare, it's becoming more salient in their own lives. Because I think environmentalism is kind of a luxury belief. It's something that you can commit time to mentally and maybe even in your own life.
If you're not fearing for your own life and the lives of your loved ones.
And if you're not fearing that you're not going to be able to ever afford a house and ever be able to start a family or anything else like that. And I think that as things continue to deteriorate in terms of crime and migration, we're only going to see that line there increase as these luxury beliefs fall away in the face of what's actually happening out on the street on a day-to-day basis. The fact that a lot of young men fear for the safety of their mothers and their sisters and their cousins and eventually their daughters. I think and worry about having their phone snatched out of their hand when they're walking the streets.
Well, I suppose that jump at the end would lined up with the Southport murders, wouldn't it?
Well, it did, yeah. And that's I think definitely noteworthy. But I think broadly speaking, and I think as this graph to an extent bears out, the desires of the majority of young people are not unreasonable, and they're not particularly different to previous generations, because there is a small contingent of young people who are politically engaged, and within that contingent there is a percentage who are radically left-wing, who I would describe as essentially being the foot soldiers of power, because they have bought hook, line and sinker into the narratives that they've been fed from authority for their entire lives, whether that's things like climate, as we've seen here, whether it's things on identity politics, race, gender, sexuality, and all the rest of it, or even economy. They are communists in a lot of cases, these people. And I view those people, it's interesting what's happened to those people. And this is something that I've tried to explain to people who are that way inclined in my own life. That does it ever bother you, or do you ever stop to consider the fact that all of your opinions line up with JP Morgan Chase, or Amazon, or Google, or the UK government, or the civil service, or the Tony Blair Foundation? You are the foot soldier of power without actually realizing it, and you've bought into these ideas that have been sold to you as being radical and sold to you as being rebellious, and that natural rebellious young spirit is attracted to that kind of thing. But they don't realize that they're actually just being, sold a lie, ultimately. Yeah, they're being sold a bill of goods that doesn't have their best interests at heart. Then within the contingent, you have the emerging, more radical, sort of right-wing section of young people, which is primarily men, has to be said.
Which is obviously terrifying them, and so they feel the need to create a series like Adolescence and make everybody watch it.
Yes, and I do think that the power structure that governs this country is certainly aware of that fact. But I think the narrative that's hugely widespread is overplayed, and I think that it's actually maybe a bit indulgent on our side of things to think that all young people are super based.
It's a very online narrative.
It's just not true, right? It's just not true, because what most ordinary young people want is not some kind of revolution. It's not some kind of huge shake-up. There is an appetite for radicalism, but actually it's all in service of being able to start a family and being able to afford a house, being able to work a job that pays them fairly and for which they're not excessively taxed, and maybe at the end of the day have a bit of money left over to go on holiday. I mean, seriously, I think that's what it comes down to. And I think it's easy to indulge in these ideas that there's going to be some kind of massive uprising of super based young people, but I just don't think that's going to happen. I don't think frankly things are bad enough for that to happen yet. And I think that it's a good thing that the desires of most young people are pretty ordinary and pretty similar to those of their grandparents. Because I'm not going to sit here and say that all young people are like super traditional, but insofar as tradition is a source of comfort and safety and identity, things like family and community and nationhood even, I think that we are going to see trends in that direction. So recently I've written a series of articles for the Daily Mail on these topics. So the first one was on the figures that came out of Channel 4, which suggests that 52% of under 30s would be quite happy to do away with democracy and have a strong leader who does not have to bother with Parliament and elections.
I think well would.
Yeah, well, there's a number of reasons for this, because I think this caused some real shockwaves when it dropped this data, because democracy is one of these things. First of all, was sold as a crucial British value in the education system. It's still enshrined in law.
It's a complete sham, though.
Yeah, since 2015, as being a fundamental part of our identity as a nation. But actually, I think that young people, again, people my age and younger, are coming to realise that, what kind of people is this system that we have right now that is called liberal democracy? What kind of people are they selecting for? It's selecting for people, one, who are good at winning elections, which is the type of people who are prepared to say things in order to be popular, who are prepared to take money in order to run their campaigns, because running for office is expensive. And so these are people who are completely devoid of authenticity.
Well, I've said yesterday that the only thing that matters within the democracy is who is selecting the people that you can vote for.
Well, exactly, yes. And I'll tell you this.
Those people are going to be globalists, if you want to use that word. They're going to be people with their own interests who are going to select people who will only work for their interests.
Well, just as a quick aside, I can tell you, like from personal experience, that in the Conservative Party, for example, the selection process for candidates is split into three different types of seat. There are those which are completely unwinnable, those which are swing, and those which are safe. And generally speaking, candidates will advance through those three seats. So they'll go through three elections. First one, they're in a unwinnable. Second one, they're in a maybe. And the third one, they're in a safe one, if they toe the party line and if they're loyal. So this is not selecting it's certainly not selecting for merit, certainly not selecting for competence. It's selecting for
toadies.
Yeah, and not loyalty to the country, but loyalty to a party. And as far as I'm aware, the same is true in the Labour Party. Although
I won't name any names, but I know people who have become Tory MPs and when I look back now, these are some of the most toady people that I know. They're yes men.
Yes, so that's the actual government side of democracy. But once again, I say that most young people don't care about any of that. They don't watch the news. They don't care about any of this. And so once again, it comes back to the lived reality. And so we're told we live in a democracy. We're told that democracy is the greatest form of government conceivable, and that we've found the final answer to how we run our societies. But actually, what is that delivering for young people? Well, it's everything I've said already. Can't afford a house, excessive tax, jobs where you are working for a corporation that doesn't care about you, to which you are just a number on a spreadsheet for a boss that doesn't care about you and who you probably hate, in a brightly lit, air-conditioned environment that's completely against your natural kind of desires and biology. That's
bad enough for men, but they co-opt women into this.
Yes.
They've convinced them you're better off working for a boss who is completely indifferent to you rather than having children.
Yes.
Well,
which
women
is
are more natural conformists.
Yeah, and that's also true. But you know, and
no offense to the anti-conformist ladies watching right now.
Indeed, but that's then to say nothing of the crime. It's nothing to say nothing of the demographic reality and the migration. To say nothing of the price of energy. Once again, on the altar of net zero. To say nothing of the deindustrialization that's taken place in this country since the 80s, where young men, for example, who would probably be happier and more productive working with their hands, are forced into these environments where they feel completely, they feel alien.
Well, they're forced to work in an office environment where they have to go to 8 to 10 meetings a day.
Yeah, and for what?
Organised for women. It's basically adult daycare to stop women having children.
Well, indeed. And so that's what democracy is delivering for young people. In other words, it's delivering nothing. It's delivering nothing of substance. And I think that in reaction to that, it's not surprising that young people are saying, well, why are we even bothering with any of this in the first place? And I will say that in terms of this particular story, I do think that the demographic data that I cited at the start is actually relevant, because I think there's a foreign appetite for the strongman that is becoming more prevalent in British culture because of the demographic shifts that we are undergoing. But actually, I don't think that it's just that. I think that there is a genuine appetite among young people on the left and the right, those who are politically engaged, who are done with democracy. Yep. And that's a controversial thing to say. But what it speaks to is the breakdown of the sacred narratives that have been, essentially had a stranglehold on our culture for the better part of the last 50 years. Things like democracy, liberalism and progress and all this sort of thing.
I get why the oligarchy that controls the democratic system at the moment and gatekeeps it, I understand why they like it.
Yeah, but again, if you actually then contrast the promises of democracy with the lived reality on the ground, where the high streets are boarded up, or full of shops that are very obvious fronts for money laundering, or there's graffiti everywhere, or litter, naming no names, Swindon, and all the rest of it, the lived reality is not progress. The lived reality is decline. And so it's no surprise that young people are turning to the system that's presided over this decline and say, well, what's the point of any of this, right? The next article I wrote was on the topic of conscription and military service, because this was citing data that found that only 11% of Gen Z would fight for Britain, with 41% saying that there are no circumstances at all in which they would pick up arms, including actual invasion.
Well, Charlie, when I first met you, it was probably only a couple of years ago. You were trying to join the army at the time.
That's right. Yeah, viewers may remember from that time that I was going through the application process, and as I've said on the show already, I was denied entry to the army. So I was a young man, a patriotic young man. Patriotic. I'm full of these Americanisms today. It's very bad. Patriotic young man who I was prepared to put my politics to one side to pursue a career in the army because I liked the lifestyle, the physical demands, the strategy, the organisational skills, and
camaraderie.
The leadership.
In fact, you get to blow stuff up every now and again.
Exactly. Yeah. Because sure, people say that the army is all woke and all the rest of it, but actually, when push comes to shove, an army is an army, and it doesn't really matter about the superficial.
I saw an ad for the army on social media the other day. Basically, everyone was represented with one omission.
Oh, yeah?
No white men on it anywhere.
Well, that suggests that we're not going to be going to war anytime soon. So perhaps that's a good thing.
That's a change from even earlier this year.
Yes.
Well, they've obviously changed their mind. Okay, actually, the threat of war is off. We can go back to...
actually going on a ground war against Russia would be really stupid of us.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, actually, if we are going to have a ground war in Russia, I kind of like the ad. It's like, yeah, go on, fill your boots.
But once again, this, I think, comes back to just the lived reality of young people in this country. Because why would you fight for a regime that has presided over just pure decline, that's told you that you're evil and racist for belonging to this country? Yes. And another study that I cited in this article was the fact that 48% of Gen Z do believe that this country is racist. Now, I'm forgetting off the top of my head where that data was from, but I remember seeing it, and the people who were interviewed as part of the coverage for it were let's just say their parents and grandparents probably weren't born here, right? So I think that there is a certain bias in that figure. But at the same time, again, anecdotally, I can tell you that it is quite a widespread opinion that Britain's history, at the very least, is racist, and that institutional racism is a problem. Because once again, this is a narrative that
we've declined since then.
Yeah, but figures of authority have told young people that narrative, and why wouldn't we believe it? If figures of authority, if teachers and people on the news are saying that, well, why would you challenge it? Because I think there is a narrative that young people are all super radical, and I think there is a contingent for whom that's true. But actually, for the most part, young people are the most conformist element of any society, because it's all they've ever known, these narratives. But actually, I think that, you know, the fundamental reason for this particular story about young people not being prepared to fight for the country, it does come back to what I've said already. It comes back to the fact that there are more pressing concerns right now. Because if you think of those lads who went off in the First and Second World War to fight, you know, quote, for Britain, there was at least a degree of material prosperity and cohesiveness and a sense of belonging, which you've already brought up today, in the country for which they were fighting. But young people today feel like they are just completely adrift and without roots in Britain, because this country has been so deculturized or deculturated. That,
I mean, if they try to do conscription now, I'm probably too old at this point, but I'll just put me in prison. I'm not doing it. I don't care about it. I said in this article that I would sooner be a conscientious objector than be sent to Ukraine or Gaza to fight for what amount to the foreign policy interests of the American State Department and indeed the British government. Because once again, if I at least had the sense that they were in my corner, if I at least had the sense that the British government was on my side and had my best interests at heart, I'd be more open to it, right? But they don't. And it's a tangible reality that they don't. And so the next story that I wrote was came out on Wednesday, St. George's Day, about English identity. And this was I think this is the crucial part of all of this, is that young people, Gen Z, under 30s, we are a generation without identity, because we've been taught that identity is to be found in some form of individual self-expression, whether that's the pursuit of a career or the pursuit of consumerism or the pursuit of credentials in the forms of university, education, all the rest of it, or indeed the pursuit of identity in things like sexuality and race and gender and all that sort of thing. And I think we're finding that on the other end of that is nothing. It's just emptiness, depression and anxiety. A quarter of Gen Z are depressed, and half say that they are anxious all the time. And it's no surprise, because without a sense of rootedness and belonging, you are just, you're out in the wilderness, and that's quite a stressful place to be. And it's obviously not a physical wilderness. I mean, the shops are still full of food, the lights still turn on, the car still starts, and all the rest of it. But it's a spiritual wilderness. It's a metaphysical the other 25% must be watching Lotus eaters then.
Well, maybe, yes, indeed. But I, in this story, spoke about my own lived experience, which is one of these concepts that, it's owned by the left, but actually I think the right should be co-opting it, because the lived experience of the English Zoomer, for example, is very relevant, I think, to the formation of our worldview and our opinions. And I contrasted, first of all, the kind of the culture in which I was growing up, in which Britain was described as being a nation of values, in which Britain didn't really have a sense of identity, certainly from all the major mainstream mouthpieces of power. But at the same time, I had the most English childhood imaginable, right? I went to a Church of England primary school that sat next to a Saxon church over 1,000 years old. My weekends were spent going to castles and manor houses and gardens and ruins and exploring them, or there was a small local theatre we used to go to and watch renditions of Shakespeare. And on holiday, we'd go to Cornwall and Dorset and Sussex and, eat roast dinners in pubs and have scones and tea in tea rooms and have picnics on the beach and all the rest of it. These very stereotypical English pursuits. And we would watch Fawlty Towers and Alan Partridge and listen to the Beatles and Oasis and read The Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter and all this sort of thing. And I think it was a revealed preference, because my parents didn't know what they were doing, but they were just giving me what they thought was a good upbringing. It was a phenomenal, fantastic upbringing. I wouldn't have had it any other way. And I want to give my own children that same gift, right? The gift of an English childhood. But I fear that is going away. And so I think that the right in general needs to understand that the fundamental question, when it comes to we Zoomers, is one of identity, because we wonder why kind of left-wing identity politics has been so big over the last 10 years. And it's partly because it's been propped up by power. It's partly because it's been centred and funded by large, powerful organisations. But it's also because we're looking for identity. And so the first thing that comes our way, whether that is, the climate stuff or the race stuff or the gender stuff or whatever, or the LGBT or the rest of it, we're going to jump at that chance. But actually, I say that the right should be embracing identity, and we should be saying, look, these nouveau sources of identity that you're being offered by the power structure that currently governs us, it doesn't have your best interests at heart. And ultimately, on the other end of them, you're not going to find a sense of belonging. Actually, where you will find a sense of belonging is in those traditional sources of identity that the power structure has told us to avoid and to ignore and to regard as being oppressive and backwards and old-fashioned. Things like the family and the community and the nation and faith. And so that's why, as much as I say the majority of young people are not political, and as much as I say that there is still a liberal outlook for the majority of them, whether they realise it or not, there is a revealed preference coming through now for these traditional sources of identity as things continue to, frankly, decline, because we need a refuge from the kind of chaos of the modern world. And I think that refuge will be, inevitably, in tradition. And so I think that it is, as much as the Zoomers are decried and derided as being kind of a bit pathetic and a bit weak and all the rest of it, I really do believe that it is going to be our generation that finds and rekindles these things that are actually foundational to civilization. And so I suppose I'll leave it there. My point here is that I think that we too often are prepared to come down on young people as being, stupid and out of touch and clueless about the world. And maybe that's true, and maybe part of that is because of the education that we've been through. But actually, our desires are not particularly different to any other generation. We just want to belong. And, well, I think we're finding where belonging actually is, and it's in things like family and nation and tradition.
If you would like to watch the full uncut version that is also uncensored, head on over to lotuseaters.com to find out more.